Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name's Mark Malcolmson. I have the huge honour and privilege of being the principal here at City Lit. And I'm delighted to welcome all of you who kind of know us, and there's also a few guests who might not know us. So I know we have something of the Dr. Sutton fan club here, and I am delighted to be hosting this particular event. You know, on any particular year, we teach 6,000 courses. We teach over 1 million learner hours. The core of what we do at any particular point is this wonderful, wonderful teaching establishment that gives every array of everything. And any time of the day you can be learning Latin, Sanskrit, art history, Caravaggio, whatever it might be. And then every now and again, one of our tutors has a little secret. And the little secrets often are, well, I've been writing this thing for a while and I've got it published. And we've actually got 3 of those. We've had one already in the summer, where one of our colleagues in art history wrote an amazing book about British art history. We've got Paul, and then we've got one of the other colleagues in humanities and creative writing whose book is coming out in February. And it is something that just delights me, because it shows that we're not just this great teaching establishment, but we're also an intellectual powerhouse. Paul is the coordinator of our film studies program, and over the last few years has taken it to new heights. It's an amazing program, and actually lives and inhabits this wonderful room, so it's very appropriate that Paul's being able to sort of do his talk here tonight. But this is it, the book. This is the opening, this is the publishing day, this is the opening night, this is the premiere. And I'm honoured to have been asked to kind of welcome you. And then when Paul's done his talk, he and I are going to have a little chat. And then afterwards, you're going to rush to get a glass of wine and also get a copy of the book signed by the great man himself. But without further ado, I am genuinely delighted. Dr. Paul Sutton.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. And yes, you've saved me from waving it around, but actually this is the first time I've seen it, so it does actually look rather great, so I am quite chuffed. Anyway, good evening, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for coming, for being here. Kind of feels strange, because as Mark said, I mean, I'm in here teaching all the time, so if I slip into teaching mode, you know, just put your hand up and tell me to stop. But it's really lovely to have a chance to, you know, be able to kind of introduce the book and to hopefully tell you a little bit about Agnès Varda. Some of you, I think, will know her very well. I've got students here tonight who are getting to know her very well, and possibly more than they want to. But it's lovely to have you here as well. So, as Mark said, there's going to be a kind of in-conversation element to this evening. But I am going to talk about Varda and who she was. But before I do that, I thought it would be helpful if I showed some clips from some of her films. So what I'm going to do is show you a kind of 10-minute show reel, if you like, that I put together. It's not the best edited. It was, you know, not the best program that I was using. So I do apologise if some of the edits were a little bit clumsy, but hopefully it will give you a sense of Varda's work. I should say that the program I was using didn't carry across some of the subtitles. The ones that are really important are there, so don't worry. But there are the odd bits of French that you might need to just kind of listen to and enjoy. So I'm going to put the lights down in a second, show you 10 minutes or so of Varda, and then I'll talk about her myself. So just bear with me a second, and I will call that up.
Autant en parler tout de suite.
Quand je t'ai connu, il n'y avait pas de question.
Laisse notre amour.
Sans toi, c'est trop. Je ne peux plus. C'est affreux.
Vous voulez que je vous emmène?
Non merci, je reste là.
Pourquoi faire?
Pour voir.
Vous savez que vous en avez pour 8 heures au moins.
On ne fera jamais qu'une journée à plein temps. J'ai de quoi fumer et me couvrir. Merci quand même.
Ma position est secrétaire de la communication au Black Panther Party. Je travaille directement avec ce que nous appelons le ministère de l'Information. Nous créons ce ministère qui s'occupera de diffuser les informations, les publications, les journaux, magazines, tracts, contact avec la presse pour distribuer notre matériel, créer des bibliothèques, sonothèques, s'assurer de l'imprimerie, ce genre de choses.
Distribution of literature, arranging printing, building tape libraries, making sure there's printed publication, this type of thing.
Et moi, je me suis souvent demandé, quand j'ai lu le livre de Miller,
La même chose avec moi. C'est ce que je voulais toujours.
Qui est-ce?
C'est ma pauvre sœur Marcel. C'est ma pauvre sœur Marcel. Ma pauvre sœur Marcel. Oh, je n'aimais pas ces chats.
Quand on est si vieux, c'est mieux que rien des chats.
Oh, mais vous n'êtes pas Yolande, vous. Quand on a une tête comme ça, et plus petite, vous n'êtes pas Yolande. Qui est-ce?
C'est Mona. Et vous, Mémé, c'est quoi le petit nom?
Titi, vous m'avez fait un choc.
Alors, mettez-vous, Mémé.
Oh, mais j'aimerais bien un verre.
C'est pas du muscat qu'elle a mis la Yolande, c'est du cognac.
Merci.
Chin.
Oh là là, ben, si mon me voyait, ça lui embaucherait une toute force.
Ton neveu, il attend que tu t'en ailles. Les neveux, c'est tous des vautours.
Oh, je je sais, mais je ne dis rien. Oh, oh, oh. Oh non. Quand il arrive avec son petit bouquet de fleurs et qu'il me dit « Bonjour, tante Lydie. Oh, mais aujourd'hui, tu es en pleine forme. » Oh, je sais qu'il voudrait ma maison. Mais... C'est bon, c'est bon. Oh là là.
Un autre? Allez, un petit coup encore.
Oh, un petit coup. Un petit coup. Tout petit. Là, aïe.
Parce que t'es drôle.
Il y a longtemps, on ne pouvait arriver dans l'île qu'à marée basse par la route submersible. Ici, on oblige les visiteurs à attendre la marée basse.
Okay, so hopefully that's given you a little taste of Varda and her work, not only her films but also her installation work that came kind of later on in her career. And as you can see, very much a cat lover. So, when news emerged that Agnès Varda had died on the 29th of March 2019 at the age of 90 from complications associated with breast cancer, there was an outpouring of grief in her native France and around the world as well. You can see a mourner there laying flowers in the Rue Daguerre where she had lived for so much of her life. Varda, I suppose, in a sense, had become something of a national treasure. And one of the things that mourners did was to start to deposit heart-shaped potatoes outside her Rue Daguerre home. She had been referred to sometimes as La Dame Patate, the potato lady, and she'd become associated with potatoes, particularly those that resembled hearts, as far back as 1953, when she'd actually photographed one in black and white, calling it pomme de terre cœur, heart potato. But they're also absolutely very much associated with the film that we saw in that very rapidly edited sequence, Les Gleaners et la Glaneuse, The Gleaners and I, from 2000. And Varda received fan mail from those who were who loved her work, who would send her photographs of heart-shaped potatoes. So this sort of idea of the potato in this particular shape is something that kind of stuck and became very much associated with Varda. So I'm just going to sort of briefly sketch out her life. It's necessarily very much a kind of condensed portrait, but just to give you a sense of kind of who she actually was. So she was born, as you can see on that slide, Arlette Varda, not Agnès, 30th of May 1928, born in a suburb of Brussels, Ixelles. Her father was originally from Greece, but he had become a naturalized French citizen. Her mother was French, came from the Jura Mountains. Arlette, as she was then known, was one of 5 children, separated in age from both her elder and younger siblings. And Varda said, "I felt independent in the middle," as she recalls in her documentary film, The Beaches of Agnès, that she made in 2008. Now, her life in Brussels, her early life, seems to have been very much a comfortable one. Her father was a successful engineer and a factory owner. And it's from this period that Varda's love of the sea, which we see over and over again in her films, was forged. Really because they spent a lot of their holidays at various Belgian seaside resorts. So here we see her name inscribed, almost about to be kind of obliterated by the incoming tide. Now, her life in Belgium came to an abrupt end with the intrusion of outside circumstances that were to alter and end the lives of so many in Europe and beyond. And the chain of events that began with Germany's Nazi invasion of Poland in September 1939 led to the attack on Belgium and the Netherlands in May 1940. The Vardas were forced to flee, seeking refuge in France. They ended up in southern France in a town called Sète, which is a port near Montpellier. They lived there on a yacht until 1942, when the German occupation of the Vichy zone forced them to move again, this time to Paris. Now, the friends, and in particular the Schlegel family that Varda made in Sète, were to prove crucial to her both personally and professionally. So Valentine Schlegel, nicknamed Linu, lived with Varda for 7 years in Paris. And although Varda herself never spoke publicly about the friendship, it's been suggested more recently that they were lovers. And unusually for the time, Valentine was openly gay. Now, Valentine's older sister, André, married the actor and theatre director Jean Vilar, and he was a figure who was absolutely key to establishing Varda as a photographer in the early part of her career. Now, as that career as a photographer developed, Varda became increasingly interested in extending the frozen moment of the still photograph. And in 1954, she started work on her first film, La Pointe Courte, which was released in 1955. One of the things that's kind of central to Varda's filmmaking is the idea of place and of space too, actually. And it's there in many of her creative endeavours throughout her career. And it's absolutely the case in terms of this particular film, whose setting is that place where Varda had spent that time when she was a young woman. And it's a place that remained absolutely dear to her throughout her life. Now, as her career as a filmmaker began to develop, Varda continued to pursue her photographic interests alongside that. She went to China in 1957, took photographs, did the same in Cuba in 1962, producing a film off the back of those still images. She had had a brief relationship with the actor Antoine Bourseillet in 1957, which led to the birth of her daughter Rosalie in May 1958. And Rosalie is in some ways a very key figure, actually, in terms of ensuring the kind of legacy of her mother's work. Now, that same year, Varda met the filmmaker Jacques Demy, who she married in January of 1962, and they honeymooned in Noirmoutier, this island that is connected via a causeway to France's Atlantic coast. And they would later have a son together, Mathieu, who was born in October of 1972. And Mathieu himself has gone on to work as a film director. Now, the careers of both filmmakers, Varda and Demy, took them to the United States, first of all between 1966 and 1969, and she has some very interesting memories of that particular period, and then secondly between 1979 and 1982. Now, in 1979, Jacques Demy left Varda for David Bombick, a man that he had met while on an earlier trip to the United States back in 1972. And Varda's film Documentaires, we can see an image from it there, which he made in 1982, was a kind of emotional response to this separation. And the film is subtitled, as we saw earlier, An Emotion Picture. And in some ways, this is possibly, despite the fact that it's a drama, it's the film in which Varda is kind of most openly, in a sort of raw fashion, actually mourning the end, I think, of that relationship, although she does explore aspects of that many times over in future work. So Varda and Demy remained apart until 1989, when Demy returned to France after Bombick had died from AIDS, and he himself had discovered that he was HIV positive. He himself developed AIDS, and he died in October 1990. Varda's response to this kind of personal crisis, this trauma, was to throw herself into work. So she completed a film that she'd been working on with Demy, which was about his life as a filmmaker, Jacques de Nantes, from 1990. And she made two further films very quickly that also reflected on his career. And she would work through her grief for Demy in a number of projects, some of which were cinematic and some of which were artistic, visual arts installations. The Gleaners and I, from 2000, in a sense is a crucial film because it paves the way for the final part of Varda's career as a sort of visual / installation artist, and it marks the beginning of what she herself called her digital phase. The earlier part she'd characterised as analogue, and we can see her there with a digital video camera. And that sort of late entry into the world of fine art was to prove a captivating extension to her previous incarnations as both a photographer and a filmmaker. So that's a very kind of quick run through Varda's life. Obviously, have a look at this if you want to find out more. But Varda, I think, a fascinating, complex figure who, while appearing often to reveal a great deal of herself in her work, actually always kept herself at a professional distance. So her increasing popularity, certainly later on in her career, which sort of stemmed from her sort of chatty little old lady character, seen immortalised here in this cartoon for the film Faces, Places from 2017, kind of led to a creation, I suppose, of a persona or character that one might call Agnès, who was perhaps a little different to Varda. And there's no doubt, I think, that her curiosity, her drive to ask questions, her sense of fairness and justice, and innate kindness perhaps, traverses both Agnès and Varda. But to succeed in an industry historically dominated and still governed primarily by men, she needed to be tough. And as we will see, Varda was extremely astute as a manager of her own career, setting up her own production company very early on, recognizing the importance of marketing and her particularly personal version of it, as well as the income streams available through video DVD releases of her films. She was also an expert commentator on her own work, as the books, articles, and interviews that she published demonstrate. And as numerous accounts attest, there was a steely determination behind the benign exterior. Jeff Andrew, for example, ex-editor of Time Out magazine's film pages and a regular contributor to Sight and Sound, writing in 2019 after Varda's death, put her rise beyond the preserve of a committed cinephile audience down to the success of her final two films, so Faces, Places being one of them, but also to her honorary Oscar, awarded on the 11th of November 2017. Of his own meetings with Varda, he recalled someone who, this is a quote from him, knew her own mind, knew what she wanted, and knew how to get it. And he recounts an anecdote involving a late-running Varda at a film festival where the organisers had started a screening in her absence. On her arrival, the film was halted. She spoke briefly and then required that the film was restarted from the beginning, although it was already 30 minutes in. Now, for Andrew, this is indicative of a certain implacability, but I have to say I see something of the artistic perfectionist, can't even say the word, who values the audience's proper experience of their work. But another anecdote that he mentions kind of reveals a warmth and a generosity. So Varda taking the time to ensure that in the company of French speakers, Andrew was kept abreast of the conversation by Varda's translations and her gradually kind of pushing the other speakers towards English. The actress Sandrine Bonnaire, who plays Mona Bergeron in Vagabond from 1985, and we saw a clip from that with Marthe Jarnet and Bonnaire giggling over a glass of brandy. She was a firm friend of Varda's, and she spoke often of how very demanding Varda could be on set, but actually how incredibly generous she was outside of the work environment. And in an interview in the mid-1980s, published in the magazine Film Quarterly, Barbara Quart says to Varda, "You've talked about having a new experience with feminism in the early 70s, to which Varda responds vehemently, what do you mean, a new experience? I've been a feminist since I was 19 years old, fighting for serious rights. I've been for the same wages, for contraception. I started early, really." She also had a habit of undermining academic writing on her work, saying, "This reputation for being intellectual that people make me shoulder, it weighs me down and it's phony." Now, Varda was certainly renowned for her work ethic and her energy. She freely admitted to having no patience whatsoever and was often described in terms that noted her indefatigability. Anatole Daumont, one of her producers early on, talked of her tireless energy, and Chris Dark, writing in Film Comment in 2008 when Varda was almost 80, refers to her as frighteningly energetic. She describes herself as un peu speedy, a little bit speedy when it comes to work. "I exhaust the people I work with because I'm so fast at what I do and so demanding." And the photographer JR, with whom Varda co-directed Faces Places, said, "I had a lot of problems because she was so tough. She had 85 years of experience. I only had 30-something years." The warmth of the rapport between these two is very evident, I think, in the film. And while he remembers her as tough, he also recalls that Agnès was in awe of life. She would always stop to observe her surroundings and recognize the beauty of things. And that sense, I think, of wonder and fascination can be seen throughout her work from her first film to her last. So the interest, for example, that she took in The Fisherman in Set in La Pointe Courte from 1955, her love of art that we see in Agnès de la Varda, her TV series that she made between 2008 and 2011, or her joy in other people that's communicated so strongly in the film with JR. All of this, I think, is what makes Varda such an enduringly humane, eminently watchable filmmaker. And if proof were needed of the significance of the work of Agnès Varda, photographer, filmmaker, video and installation artist, one need look no further than the exhibition Agnès Varda's Paris Here and There, which took place this summer, so it ended in August, at the iconic and historic Musée Carnavalet in the heart of Paris's 11th arrondissement. The exhibition was based on Varda's personal archive under the guise of her production company Ciné Tamaris, was staged by her daughter Rosalie Varda, along with a number of significant film experts, including the head or ex-head of the Cinémathèque Française and the Pompidou Centre. And what's interesting is the exhibition asserts the importance of photography in Varda's film and installation work, but it also serves, I think, to reposition Varda as a photographer of note. These images are more than just the old stuff that Varda dismissively called them. And exploring the evolution of her photographic career from its origins in the early 1950s up to 2018, the exhibition offered a really fascinating portrait of an evolving creative artist. Parisian Mayor Anne Hidalgo, in her foreword to the exhibition catalogue, spoke of her pleasure that Agnès Varda's Paris Here and There would be contributing to the project to increase the visibility of women in history, arguing that not only would it shine a light on Varda's work, but on the values of humanity, liberty and justice that she believed in so strongly. Given the importance of place for Varda, the fact that she lived at 86 Rue Daguerre in the 14th arrondissement of Paris from 1951 until her death in 2019 is not insignificant. And as one commentator notes, she was a very Parisian filmmaker, even if she wasn't afraid to travel in every direction across France and the world. She was, the same commentator suggests, a poetess of the city, a flâneuse, an inheritor of Charles Baudelaire, the celebrated French poet, both fascinated by the life of the Parisian street. And certainly while Paris and France were central to Varda's filmic identity, she was an international filmmaker too, travelling to and drawing inspiration from all corners of the globe. Her curiosity about and love for so many countries was returned with interest as her reputation grew in the final phase of her almost 65-year career. In the UK, for example, she was greatly loved and hugely respected. Now, the long-standing British film magazine, Sight and Sound, which many of you know, I'm sure, has been running a 10-yearly critics poll since 1952, listing the greatest films of all time. And in its latest poll, which was undertaken in December 2022, Varda has no less than 4 films in the list. Now, the only other 2 filmmakers with a similar number are both men, Alfred Hitchcock and Jean-Luc Godard. And those films are Le Bonheur, or Happiness, which is at number 152, equal place, and then Vagabond at joint number 101. We've got The Gleaners and I, tied at number 67, and one of her best-known films, Cleo from 5 to 7, sits at number 14. Quite an achievement, I think you'll agree. And it's not just an indication of her significance and recognition, but very much cements her position, I think, as one of the truly great filmmakers. And it's worth also noting that her husband, Jacques Demy, has a couple of films in the list as well, including the very well-known The Umbrellas of Cherbourg from 1964. So on the 12th of May 2018 at the Cannes Film Festival in France, Varda marched in a group of 82 women, which included Kate Blanchett, Kristen Stewart, Céline Sciamma and others, as well as members of the 50-50 in 2020 collective, to highlight the male bias of this world-famous event. At that time, only 82 women had been invited to compete for a prize since the festival first began in 1946. By contrast, 1,688 male directors had had their films in competition during the same period. In its 71-year history, only 2 women film directors had been awarded the prestigious Palme d'Or, Jane Campion in 1993 for her film The Piano, and Varda, who received an honorary Palme d'Or in 2015. And in a statement, the collective said, "Women are not a minority in the world, and yet our industry says the opposite. We want this to change." For cinephiles, film journalists and academics, Varda has long been seen as vital and significant. However, there's no doubt that since the early 2000s, her reputation and her influence has grown substantially, especially among younger women filmmakers. Her role as a campaigner for women's rights in the film industry undoubtedly has played a part in this too. Directors like Mia Hansen-Love, Chloe Zhao, Alice Rohrwacher, for example, have all spoken about the debt they owe to Varda as a pioneering feminist filmmaker. Writing in 2023, Zhao said, "I believe voices like Varda's are essential because just like the world we live in, masculine and feminine energy in cinematic storytelling is out of balance. We, as an industry, are built on celebrating masculine qualities in storytelling and in life. There are people like Agnès who dared to find the balance before we even started to realize the danger of our collective imbalance." And Rohrwacher has also spoken about her admiration for Varda, commending her great ability to stick to her own voice. And she finds Varda's ability to combine the personal with the general in her filmmaking especially noteworthy, saying that even when she tells stories that are so connected to her own gaze and her own life, they still succeed in being universal. So this bringing together of the universal with the personal was a key facet of Varda's oeuvre, visible, I think, in her fictional dramas, as in her short essay films and documentaries, and of course in her photographs and her visual artwork as well. Her life story, her autobiography, has been told on numerous occasions by Varda herself. So in her 2-volume memoir, Varda par Agnès, Varda by Agnès, and also in her cinematic self-portrait, The Beaches of Agnès, that she made in 2008. A biography was published last year, and today, finally, so is my book. Described very kindly, and this feels like, you know, excessive self-promotion, so I do apologise, but 2 lovely reviews, I suppose, of the book have suggested, on the one hand, a fabulously worthwhile addition to the ever-growing corpus of scholarly attention to Varda's life works by one of my favourite writers on cinema. Paul Sutton builds brilliantly on earlier studies, adding to them a detailed sense of almost the entirety of Varda's biography and her oeuvre, paying particularly valuable attention to the films and digital collections, exhibitions and installations of her final years. The book concludes by offering up a remarkable bibliography and filmography that, like the volume as a whole, provides a wonderfully informative overview of the work of a truly essential artist. And one more. Agnès Varda was a unique and much-loved filmmaker and artist whose work ranged across photography, cinema and contemporary art in a career that lasted over 60 years. Paul Sutton's comprehensive and highly readable book covers her life and work with commendable thoroughness, including plentiful biographical detail, a developed sense of her cultural context, and illuminating critical insights. Its film-by-film format makes it an ideal companion for those exploring Varda's work for the first time, as well as for those wishing to extend their familiarity with the faces and places of her world. Highly recommended for students and teachers, newcomers and adepts alike. So, just before I finish, just 1 or 2 thank yous. To Chris Dark and to Katie Grant for their very kind comments on the book. Thanks to my students on my Varda and my Cultureplex Cine Club courses, both past and present. A thank you to Aurora Metro Publishing, Cheryl Robson, Sally Mears, Lucy Melville and the rest of the team. Thanks to my mum, Jill Sutton, for taking me to Paris when I was 11 years old. It was the catalyst for a lifelong Francophilia. And a huge thanks to my partner, Emma, for giving up her summer, viewing almost all of Varda's films with me, and for reading countless draft chapters along the way. I couldn't have done it without you. And finally, a thank you to Agnès Varda herself for all the wonderful films, photographs and works of art that she gave to us. And of course, thank you to you all for being here to share the launch of my book. Thank you very much.
Paul, right.
Yes.
How did the book come about?
Well, that's, interesting. One of my students on a course that I've been running down at the BFI on Italian neorealism, Sally Mears, had wanted to sign on to a Varda course that didn't actually run, interestingly, a year or 2 ago. But she mentioned this to Cheryl Robson, who she works for, and put me in touch with Cheryl. And we started to sort of explore the idea of a book on Varda, one that would, I suppose, try to cover, the entirety really of her output in a way that maybe hasn't quite been done before, but also in a format that was accessible to, not just an academic audience, but to sort of the general reader interested in film. So there's a lovely City Lit connection in terms of how the book came about in the first place. So it's down to this place, really.
Everything's down to this place, let's be honest. Your personal interest, obviously, Mum takes you to Paris age 11, and we're here now. Fill in the intervening bit around particularly your relationship with Varda.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. I think, I've long had an interest in French cinema, and that is definitely down to, studying French at school, going to Paris, spending time in France as a teenager, and having that opportunity to learn to speak French, etc. And I suppose it's really as I started to pursue a sort of academic career that sort of interest, specific interest in French cinema developed. Now, I was aware of Varda for a long time, and I knew the key films, the important films. I knew Cleo and I knew Vagabond. But actually it wasn't until a course I was teaching at University of Roehampton that I taught actually with Chris Dark, which introduced me to her 2000 film, The Gleaners and I. And I was so amazed by this film. I mean, it's just an incredible piece of work, really. It's an essay film, and Varda's tapping into things that I think in many ways, in typical Varda fashion, she's kind of ahead of the game often. And that's what provoked, I suppose, a desire to start to think about, some of the other stuff that she'd done and to start to explore, the back catalogue, so to speak. And so I think it's probably from that moment that I really started to, realise that this was such an interesting and I suppose profound filmmaker. And of course, the further you go into the films, you then start to understand the origins in photography, how important photography was for her filmmaking. And also, you start to encounter that latter part of her career, which was also incredibly, creative. So yeah, it's been a long journey, and I suppose in terms of the book and writing the book, having taught Varda here in various incarnations. I mean, the first time actually was online during COVID. I have found myself she's been in my head, for a long time, I suppose. So the book itself was written quite quickly, actually, but it's because she'd been inhabiting my brain for so long, I think. So.
Do you remember the first film of hers you saw? Did you see it on video? Did you see it on the cinema?
Do you know what? I don't actually. I mean, it's undoubtedly Cleo, I think, which is the film that probably a lot of people, find their way into Varda's work through, because it's such a sort of well-known, such a famous film, and it's the one, of course, that is very much associated with the French New Wave. So I suspect that was my first way in. I have a rubbish memory, so.
So you don't, obviously. It's a thing. Just French New Wave, Varda, the interplay between each of them.
So I mean, it's interesting because I think in a way, I suppose this is something that's happened to many women filmmakers across the history of the cinema. But there are many cases where very important figures have been written out of the sort of the history of film. And whilst Varda wasn't written out, she certainly wasn't seen as significant or as important as she ought to have been. And I think it's more recent work that has very much sort of demonstrated that actually Varda was right there at the outset, that a film like La Pointe Courte that she made in 1955 is in some ways, a really important precursor film to what, emerged a few years later, and which we think of as the French New Wave, and most of whose names are all male. Jean-Luc Godard, François Truffaut, et cetera, Chabrol, all these kind of figures. So it's work by various women writers on Varda that has actually said, no, she's there at the outset. La Pointe Courte, the way she made the film, the production of the film, all of this is already indicative of someone who's working in the way that many of those French New Wave filmmakers went on to work subsequently. And she marries in that film very interestingly a certain kind of realism. So we see, actual fishermen going about their sort of daily business, if you like, juxtaposed with a relationship between a couple, which is incredibly sort of poeticized, artificial, etc. So it's a fascinating film, and it's her first feature film, and has really stood the test of time. Actually, I think she was called kind of disparagingly either the kind of mother or grandmother of the French New Wave. So there's a sort of recognition of her role, but it's not necessarily expressed in quite the best way.
So first film's 1951, and she's pretty
55,
much 55, and she's making films right towards the end. An amazing span.
Yeah.
Obviously, your book, we don't want to spoil the excitement for people who are going to buy it, spans that career. Are there distinct phases and developments during it?
Yes, I mean, I think Varda herself, I think as I sort of intimated there, divided her career into two broad phases, so the analogue and the digital. So the analogue takes us up to kind of 2000, and everything that comes after is all used, using digital technology. She had a break actually between 1995 and 2000. She'd made a film to celebrate the centenary of cinema. So 1995, and it was called 101 Nights, and it was an absolute disaster commercial. I mean, it was it's a fascinating film, but it didn't work. So she took a bit of a break, kind of gathered herself, and then comes back with the Gleaners and I, shot digitally in 2000. But I think she was also very aware, of her origins as a photographer. I mean, I don't know that she necessarily I think it's more important to her career than perhaps she herself suggested. And when we think about Faces, Places, which is a very well-known film of hers from 2017, where she partners with JR, a photographer, and the film is based around photography, she almost comes full circle. But actually, Varda's there's a photographic sort of composition, I think, in much of her work, and you can see it in the first film, and you can see it in subsequent films as well. And then there's this late stage, this sort of becoming a visual artist, which she clearly relished and loved. I mean, we saw her dressed up in her potato suit. That was the Venice Biennale in 2003, and it was called Patatutopia, so sort of play on the word potato and utopia. And you could see someone who's obviously reveling in this kind of newfound sort of, and she's in her mid-70s, it's amazing, I think.
It's interesting, from the clip she played, there was, you can see the photographic element to it. They're very visually striking. Any individual image is a photograph as well, which is, so you can see the interplay between sort of both bits. What, you go back to that kind of film, was she commercially successful, or was she in the kind of art house, nice little cinemas, or did she kind of traverse both areas?
I think for the most part, I think you wouldn't think of her as especially successful in commercial terms. I mean, Vagabond was a successful film, and that allowed her to do many things, actually. But the interesting thing about Varda, I think, is that she was fiercely independent. So it was her way or not at all, basically. So when she was in the States, some of the projects that might have happened didn't happen because she was not prepared to have them tell her, they wanted final edit, and said, no way, you're not telling me how to make my films. So I think Varda, she came from a reasonably well-off background. Her father left her money that allowed her to make her first film. But she also struggled at times to make films. She had to go to people to get the money together to make the films that she wanted to make. But she was, this independent voice. She had things she wanted to say, and so she, found ways to make that happen. Much more, in a sense, in that art house sort of end of things.
Because Truffaut and Godard managed to kind of span both. They get the commercial popularity, but then there's still a homage to their kind of
and
art.
I suppose, someone like Truffaut definitely, Godard, popular, and then goes off in a very particular direction and, does stuff that's more experimental and more artistic, I suppose. But and yeah, I suppose, you know, filmmakers are always traversing that kind of line between making the films they want to make and making the films they have to make, I suppose. And Varda very much, I think, you know, this is what I want to do, and I'm going to be, you know, I'm going to do it. I mean, in the clip reel that we saw, where we see the gardeners, and this is early on, you know, doing the instruments and stuff, and the sweeping, that was a commission. She was, you know, commissioned to do that, actually. But for the most part, yeah, absolutely her, you know, in charge and doing her things.
So I love this concept of her making her films and then her critiquing her own films. It's like two jobs. What did she actually think of her own work, and did she kind of change as she looked back on her earlier works and things like that? Was an arc?
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, you know, it's interesting because there's a you know, there are things that she's published. So, you know, a huge 2-volume memoir, Varda by Agnès, published in '95 and 2023. So the later volume kind of published posthumously after she died and pulled together by others, you know, to complete it. But actually those 2 volumes, and they're huge, provide, you know, huge amount of information, reflection, you know, a reflection on the films, but actually also the process of making them, the things that happened along the way. So it's a really valuable source. But there's also an incredible archive, you know, in Rue Daguerre. You know, you can visit. I mean, I didn't, but you can. And I've no doubt there's still stuff to be kind of unearthed and discovered, you know, as part of that process as other scholars, you know, explore that work. But I think Varda was, she was a very capable commentator on her own work. She was very, you know, very conscious of what she was doing. So I think, you know, her writing itself is very valuable. The interviews she gave, you know, she was very articulate, and it gives us a real sense of what it was she was seeking to do, I think, throughout her career.
So that's an interesting challenge then for you as a writer of a book about her. Do you ever get to the point going, well, I don't agree with you, Agnès, about what you said about yourself. I know better.
Yeah, that is a good question. I mean, in some ways, probably, at one level, no, because I think actually, you know, she is so able to talk through the work very, you know, I mean, in terms that are really instructive. But definitely, you know, I'm one of those academics who's laying a load of weight on Varda. You know, she said, "Oh, they do," you know, and I suppose inevitably, you know, I'm kind of doing that. But that's what we all do, you know, when we watch films. I mean, they mean things to us. That's the joy, I think, of going to the cinema. You know, that what one person sees, you know, is entirely different, possibly, to what someone else might see. And okay, Varda has what she's doing, but there's all this other stuff going on as well. So probably haven't answered your question very well.
No, but it is an interesting one, because it's not just like you've got the painting on the wall and you go, right, okay, that's what I think about it. You've got her rattling around in your head as well as your own bit. So you've got to actually just sort of tease both of those things out.
And I think, you know, she was one of those practitioners, I suppose, who are very self-aware, you know, as a filmmaker. And I think, you know, one of the things that Varda does in almost all of her films is to remind us continually that we're watching a film, that actually this is a construct. So whether it's a drama, whether it's a documentary, and it's particularly evident in the documentaries, you know, she does things to remind us. So there was a clip from a film called Uncle Yanko that she made in the US, the one with the heart, and she became aware of Uncle Yanko, who is her uncle, while she was out there, didn't know of him before, and as she shoots the meeting, she just repeats that scene from about 5 or 6 different angles to demonstrate, you know, this is a documentary, we've set this up. Of course I'm not meeting him for the first time, because we've been in conversation to make this documentary. So there's always that sense of, you know, what we're doing here is we're making a film, but actually you need to kind of remember that, and that gives us a certain critical distance, I think, as spectators, and it allows us to kind of reflect on that dynamic, on that relationship, which is important.
So for those, final question, those of us who are the uninitiated and have learnt quite a lot this evening, is, you know, go home tonight, download a couple of things on Amazon Prime. What would be your top tips for the newbies?
Yeah, I mean, I think a film like Faces Places, I think a late film, 2017, very accessible, a lovely film, very enjoyable, and actually there's a lot of the Varda that's gone before in some senses in that film. So I think that's a very good way in. But obviously, the Gleaners and I from 2000 is such an incredible film to watch, and so interesting. You, in some ways, ought to go back to her first film, Pointe Courte, which isn't necessarily the easiest of films. I mean, it sort of feels like, in some ways, it sits in that sort of 50s art house tradition, so it maybe challenges expectations in terms of narrative development, for example, but it's a fascinating film. And of course, Cleo from 9 to 5, the 1962 film, that is just wonderful. I mean, it's 2 hours in the life of Cleo Marchand, awaiting the results of a test that she's had that may indicate that she has cancer. And we spend those 2 hours with her in Paris, and we see Paris, we experience Paris, but we share time with her. And it's just a wonderful experience, I think. So, at least all of those, but there's another 40-odd films, that if you've got the time.
For the Christmas holidays, isn't it? It gets dull on Boxing Day. You've got quite a lot of genre.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you kind of choosing City Lit to launch this. Obviously, beloved part of our community here. Thank you so much for turning out to support Paul. For those of you who are in his cine clubs, longer you continue, and for those of you who are new to us, please kind of join our film society. Lovely room. Spent a lot on getting it fitted out for him. And of course, go buy this book now. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul Sutton.